Please. Emily. Richard Hayes stood outside her gate with his hat crushed between both hands. Behind him, more than 30 pickup trucks filled the gravel road. Farmers crowded along the fence, their faces gray with exhaustion. Some had dust on their shirts. Others still wore chemical masks, hanging loose around their necks. No one laughed. No one made duck sounds. No one called her crazy. Beyond them, the western sky had turned the color of dirty smoke. Except it wasn't smoke. It was moving. Millions of insects rolled across the horizon in a dark, living cloud. Richard looked past Emily toward the pasture, where hundreds of white ducks waited in the morning light. 3 months earlier, he had stood in an auction barn and told half the county that those birds were worth less than the trailer carrying them. Now the most successful farmer in Johnson County could barely meet her eyes. "My soybeans are almost gone," he said. Emily remained silent. Richard swallowed. "The corn will be next." Still, she said nothing. He glanced back at the line of farmers waiting behind him, men who had mocked her at the feed store, men who had laughed at the Farm Bureau meeting, men who had allowed their children to point at her from passing trucks. Richard lowered his head. "Please." His voice broke. "Let your ducks into my fields." Emily looked toward the darkening sky, then toward the man who had done everything he could to make sure she failed. Only 3 months before, no one in Cedar Junction would have believed this moment possible, least of all Emily Carter. When Emily inherited her father's farm, she did not inherit prosperity. She inherited 41 acres of tired Iowa soil, a leaking barn, a rusted grain bin, a tractor that started only when it felt generous, and enough debt to make a banker lower his voice before mentioning the total. Her father, Daniel Carter, had held the property together for nearly 30 years through drought, floods, 2 recessions, and the slow decline of small family farms. Cancer had done what bad weather never could. By the time he died in February, nearly everything valuable had already been mortgaged. For the first week after the funeral, the farmhouse filled with casseroles. Neighbors brought ham, potatoes, PAs, and condolences. Women from church washed dishes. Men stood in the kitchen with their hats in their hands and promised Emily that if she needed anything, she should call. By the 3rd week, the casseroles stopped. The advice began. "You're still young. You could sell before planting. There's no shame in walking away. It's too much land for one woman." Emily thanked every person politely. Then she went back to work. Each morning she rose before dawn and walked the same route her father had followed. Past the equipment shed, along the southern fence, across the low pasture where spring water gathered after heavy rain. She checked every gate, every drainage ditch, and every weak post. She wrote problems in a small black notebook and ranked them by urgency. Her father had taught her that panic was expensive. "If the barn is leaking and the tractor is broken," he used to say, "fix the thing that can ruin tomorrow first." That spring, almost everything seemed capable of ruining tomorrow. The corn planter needed repairs. The soybean seed invoice remained unpaid. Property taxes were overdue. The bank wanted a meeting. Emily attended wearing her father's old work jacket because it made her feel less alone. Mr. Collins, the loan officer, arranged several papers across his desk. "I'll speak plainly," he said. "I'd appreciate that. Your father's operating line is overextended. The property itself still has value, but without additional income, the farm won't make it through the season. How long do I have?" "Mr. Collins removed his glasses. 60 days before we begin foreclosure proceedings." Emily stared at the number printed in red on the final notice. 60 days. What would stop it? A substantial payment, or a business plan demonstrating reliable income? "I'll bring you both." "Mr." Collins looked at her with something between sympathy and concern. "Emily." Determination isn't the same as cash flow. She folded the notice carefully. "No." She stood. "But it's where cash flow starts." By the next morning, Everyone at Holloway Feed and Supply seemed to know the bank had given Emily 60 days. Farmers joked that her tractor had not run properly since Clinton was president. Emily loaded her supplies and said, "It doesn't have to run right. It only has to run." Richard Hayes waited outside in a black pickup. He owned nearly 3,000 acres. New combines, GPS-guided equipment, and enough influence to make lenders return Sunday calls. "I respected your father," he told her. "That's why I'm advising you to sell before the bank does it for you. My father never asked you to decide what happened to his land. Your father understood farming. 2 years, studying animal science, and coming home to care for him doesn't make you a farmer." "No," Emily said, closing her truck door. "Getting up tomorrow, Will." She drove away before he could answer. 3 days later, Emily attended the liquidation auction of a failed poultry operation looking for fencing panels. The final lot was 800 underfed, laying ducks with dirty feathers, bare patches, and the withdrawn posture of animals conserving strength. "Should have buried them 6 weeks ago," a rancher said. Richard, there to bid on a generator, called across the pen, "Don't get sentimental." No one offered even 50 cents a bird. Then a grasshopper landed near the wire. One weak duck darted for it, followed by another chasing a beetle. Emily remembered her grandfather releasing ducks into his orchard to eat insects and weeds. He had called them his cheapest farmhands. $200 for the flock, the auctioneer said. Emily raised her card. Richard laughed. "You cannot be serious." The hammer fell. The yard erupted with jokes about an ark, worthless feathers, and whether the bank accepted eggs. "Those birds will eat you into bankruptcy," Richard said. "You may be right." "You know I'm right." "No, I said you may be." She signed the receipt and arranged transport. By sunset, 2 borrowed livestock trailers reached the Carter farm. Margaret Wilson, Emily's 80-year-old neighbor, to cross the road with lettuce from the church kitchen. "They look terrible," she said as the ducks rushed the trough. "People think I've lost my mind." "My father kept ducks in the garden," Margaret replied. "So did my grandfather." Maybe the young people aren't the only ones who've forgotten something. For 2 weeks, Emily mixed electrolytes, separated the weakest birds, repaired shelter, and slept in fragments. Dr. Sam Holloway examined the flock and found malnutrition but no serious disease. "They need protein, clean water, minerals, and time," he said. "Can they recover?" He watched a duck chase a cricket beside his boot. "If they keep eating like that." The birds improved slowly, their feathers cleaned, their eyes brightened, and each morning they traveled farther from the barn. Emily noticed that whenever insects were available, they ignored much of the grain she scattered. They worked the fence lines first, then the drainage ditch, then the weeds beside the soybean field. At night, she searched her father's notebooks and found one sentence underlined twice. "The field rarely fails first. The neglected edges fail first." Emily wrote beneath it, "Ducks concentrate along edges, insect numbers highest there." Then she began counting. At sunrise, before releasing the flock, she walked fixed sections of fence and recorded the number of grasshoppers disturbed by 10 steps. The first day, she counted 34 near the southern ditch. 3 days after the ducks worked it, she counted 6. Along the northern fence, the number dropped from 41 to 9. The difference was too large to ignore. She divided the pasture with portable fencing and began rotating the ducks deliberately. One group worked the creek. One worked the ditches. Another moved along the border of the soybean field. She marked every section with orange survey ribbon. Soon the morning routine became visible from the road. 800 ducks moved across the pasture in a long white stream, while Emily walked ahead carrying buckets. People slowed to watch. At first, they only stared. Then the jokes began. At Holloway Feed and Supply, someone started quacking whenever Emily entered. At Miller's Diner, Richard announced that Cedar Junction had opened its first Duck University. At church, 2 women whispered that grief must have affected Emily's judgment. At the gas station, A child pointed toward her truck and asked his father whether the crazy duck lady lived nearby. The father laughed. Emily heard him. She paid for the fuel and left. The mockery became worse after the Cedar Junction Gazette published a short column titled, "Local Woman Bets Farm on Feathered Flock." The article described the purchase as unconventional and quoted two anonymous farmers who questioned whether ducks could generate enough income to prevent foreclosure. One quote said, "She needs a miracle, not a pond." Richard had not given the quote, but he repeated it several times at the diner. A week later, the County Farm Bureau held its monthly meeting. Emily attended with her notebook. The extension agronomist presented a report on seasonal pest pressure. Grasshopper numbers are moderately above average, he said, but we don't expect serious economic damage at this time. Emily raised her hand. The agronomist nodded toward her. I've counted unusually heavy numbers along drainage ditches and unmanaged field edges. Several farmers turned around. Emily continued, the populations are dropping where the ducks have been rotating, but surrounding roadsides are increasing every week. Richard leaned back in his chair. Are we discussing commercial agriculture or bird watching? Laughter spread across the room. Emily kept her eyes on the agronomist. I think farmers should scout their field borders now. Richard lifted his coffee. My operation has professional crop consultants, and they may be right. Maybe, he smiled. You've owned ducks for 3 weeks. Emily, I've watched insects longer than that. Richard stood. Let's be clear. You bought starving birds at a bankruptcy auction because no sensible producer wanted them. Now you're telling farmers with decades of experience that your flock knows something our agronomists don't? The room waited. Emily closed her notebook. I'm saying the insects are there. Richard reached into his wallet and removed a $100 bill. If those ducks save 1 acre of my farm this season, this is yours. The laughter returned. Emily looked at the bill. I don't want your money. Then what do you want? For you to check your ditches. A few men laughed even harder. Emily walked out before the meeting ended. The next morning, Frank Holloway called. You need to come into the feed store. Emily heard something in his voice. What happened? Just come. When she arrived, Frank was holding an invoice instead of her usual feed order. The delivery isn't coming, he said. I confirmed it yesterday. Your account was changed to payment in advance. The cooperative reassigned the shipment to a larger customer. Who requested the change? Frank's eyes moved toward the bank across the street, where Richard's pickup was parked. I was told the credit committee reevaluated your risk. Richard sat on that committee. He had not stolen a bag or broken a lock. He had simply used a rule designed to protect the cooperative and aimed it at the smallest farmer in town. Emily found him leaving the bank. You stopped my delivery. I stopped the cooperative from financing livestock with no commercial value. They have value. Then you should have no trouble paying cash. Emily stepped closer. You're spending a great deal of influence on something you claim doesn't frighten you. For once, Richard had no quick answer. Emily drove 80 miles to find replacement feed. The fuel and higher price consumed almost all the money she had saved for tractor repairs. 2 nights later, someone opened the pasture gate. Emily woke to frantic quacking and ran outside barefoot. The latch had been lifted and wired open. Ducks covered the road. Others disappeared into cornfields and ditches. Emily grabbed a flashlight and began calling neighbors. Tom Jenkins arrived first with his sons. Margaret came in her nightgown beneath an old work coat. For 6 hours they searched. By sunrise, 112 ducks were still missing. Tom examined the gate. This didn't open itself. Emily looked at the twisted wire. No. You know who did it? She thought of Richard, then rejected the accusation. She had no proof. I know someone wanted me to lose them. Tom looked uncomfortable. He had laughed at the auction. Now he could not meet her eyes. By the end of the day, 93 ducks had returned or been found. 19 remained missing. The following afternoon, an animal welfare inspector pulled into the driveway while a Gazette photographer was documenting the escaped birds. We received an anonymous complaint, the inspector said. Sick animals, inadequate feed, unsafe conditions. Richard, who had stopped along the road, looked toward the flock. Maybe this is for the best. At least the birds may go to someone qualified. Emily opened the gate. Inspect everything. For more than an hour, the inspector checked shelter, water, feed, records, and bird condition. Dr. Holloway arrived with his charts. Finally, the inspector faced the photographer. These birds were neglected before Ms. Carter purchased them, he said. Their recovery is evidence of competent care. Whoever filed this complaint did not come here to protect the animals. For the first time, a public attempt to shame Emily ended without laughter. After he left, Margaret stood beside Emily near the barn. Feed disappears. Gate opens. Inspector arrives. Emily said nothing. Margaret looked toward Richard's distant fields. You still think people are only laughing? That night, Emily found the bank's new letter in her mailbox. The foreclosure timeline had been shortened from 60 days to 30. The bank cited increased operational risk and the withdrawal of her feed credit. At the emergency credit meeting, Richard described the ducks as non-productive inventory and questioned whether Emily had the experience to operate the farm. Emily sat at the far end of the table without a vote. Sentiment kept Daniel Carter on that land. Richard said, sentiment will lose it for his daughter. Then Emily saw a property map beneath his papers. Her southern field lay between two sections owned by Hayes Farms. How long have you wanted my father's south field? She asked. Richard covered the map. I'm protecting the cooperative. Are you protecting it or clearing a road between your fields? No one answered. The silence told Emily enough. There was still no document proving Richard planned to buy the land after foreclosure, but his fingerprints seemed to exist on every closed door. For the first time, Emily considered selling. She sat alone at the kitchen table with the final notice in front of her. 30 days. The ducks were recovering, but they had not produced meaningful income. The tractor needed repairs. Seed bills were due. Even if the flock could control insects, she had no contract, no customers, and no time. Near midnight, she heard screaming from the pasture. A fox had crawled beneath a weak section of fence. By the time Emily reached it, 21 ducks were dead. She found 3 more at sunrise. She carried every bird beneath the cottonwood trees and buried them herself. When the last grave was filled, she sat in the grass with dirt on her hands. The farm seemed quieter than it had after her father died. Dr. Holloway found her there. I failed them, she said. You lost animals. I was responsible for them. Yes, so I failed. Sam sat beside her. Then every farmer who has ever lost an animal has failed. Emily looked at the graves. That doesn't make it hurt less. No. He waited. But failure isn't the same as being finished. She laughed bitterly. The bank would disagree. Sam glanced toward the pasture. Hundreds of surviving ducks were already moving through the weeds, catching grasshoppers. They don't seem finished. Emily watched them. One duck snapped up an insect, then another, then 5 more, even after a night of panic. The flock returned to work. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her shirt. I don't know how to save the farm. Sam stood, then save today. He offered his hand. Tomorrow can wait until morning. Emily took it. Over the next 2 weeks, she stopped trying to defend herself. She stopped reading the newspaper. She stopped entering the diner. She visited the feed store only when necessary and ignored every joke. Instead, she measured. She counted insects before and after each rotation. She photographed crop edges. She recorded weather patterns. The spring had been unusually dry. Winter had been mild. Grasshopper hatch rates were rising. She found clusters of young nymphs in roadside ditches and along the edges of Richard's fields. Thousands of them, then tens of thousands. She sent her notes to the county extension office. No one responded for 3 days. When the agronomist finally called, he sounded cautious. Your counts are higher than ours. Have you checked the unmanaged ditches? We sample commercial fields. The insects are not starting in the fields. A pause. Where are they starting? Where nobody samples. The agronomist promised to review her photographs. At the county fair, Emily discovered that someone had turned Duck University into a public joke. A wooden sign pointed toward an empty livestock pen filled with white feathers and a plastic children's pool. Duck University. It read. Below it hung a cardboard diploma. Emily Carter, Professor of Bankruptcy. A coffee can labeled, Help, Emily Feed. 800 mistakes sat beside a rubber duck. Teenagers quacked when she passed. Adults smiled. The announcer lifted the cardboard diploma. Professor Carter. He called, Will your university remain open after the bank takes the barn? Laughter rolled across the fairgrounds. Emily walked into the pen, removed the diploma, folded it once, and placed it inside her black notebook. Richard stood near the machinery display. He had not built the display, but his dealership sponsorship banner hung above it. You have to admit, he said, someone put effort into it. Did you? No. But you paid for the tent and watched them use my name? Richard shrugged. The county is tired of pretending this is a serious operation. Emily stepped closer. You cut my feed credit. You used the bank to shorten my time. Now you're standing beneath a sign that calls foreclosure entertainment. You should sell before this gets uglier. You're afraid. Richard laughed. Of ducks? Of being wrong in public. His smile disappeared. Emily folded the foreclosure letter beside the cardboard diploma in her notebook. Inside the extension tent, a regional pest bulletin had been posted that morning. Several counties west of Johnson County had reported severe grasshopper migration. The report warned that continued heat and drought could trigger rapid swarm movement. Emily photographed the bulletin. The extension agronomist approached from behind. I reviewed your records. And? You were right about the ditches. She waited. He lowered his voice. We're seeing breeding densities we haven't recorded in years. Have you warned the farmers? We're preparing a notice. When? Tomorrow. Emily looked toward the western sky. That may be too late. The agronomist followed her gaze. On the horizon, a dark stain stretched above the fields. At first it looked like storm clouds, but there was no rain in the forecast. The stain widened. A dry rattling sound began moving through the fairgrounds. People looked upward. The first grasshoppers struck the white roofs of the livestock barns like hail. Then, hundreds landed across the parking lot. Children screamed and laughed. Farmers stopped talking. Richard stepped away from the machinery display. One insect landed on his shoulder. Then another. Then 10 more. Emily remained still. She had been warning them for weeks. Now the land was finished whispering. It had begun to scream. For several seconds, no one moved. Then, the fairgrounds erupted. Parents grabbed children. Vendors pulled canvas covers over food stands. Farmers rushed toward the parking lot while thousands of grasshoppers battered truck windshields, landed in open drink cups, and crawled beneath shirt collars. The cheerful music from the midway continued playing, absurdly bright against the dry roar, filling the sky. Emily did not run. She stood beneath the extension tent and watched the western horizon darken. This was not the full swarm, not yet. These were only the insects pushed ahead of it. The extension agronomist stepped beside her. How much time do we have? Emily looked at the wind direction. Maybe a day. His face tightened. Before what? Before the main body reaches the county. Richard had come close enough to hear. He brushed several insects from his shirt. You can't know that. Emily turned toward him. No. She looked back at the sky. But I've been watching them longer than you have. She left the fair without another word. By the time she reached the Carter farm, the radio was carrying the first emergency agricultural bulletin. Large swarms had crossed 2 counties west of Cedar Junction. Soybean fields were losing leaves within hours. Road crews reported visibility problems. Chemical suppliers were overwhelmed. The county extension office advised growers to scout immediately and prepare treatment equipment. Emily switched off the radio. Preparing treatment equipment was exactly what every farmer would do. It was also exactly what the insects would expect them to do. She parked beside the barn and opened her notebook. For weeks, she had mapped every place where the ducks naturally concentrated: fence rows, ditches, creek banks, tall weeds, shaded strips beside corn. The birds rarely moved directly into the center of a field unless insects were already there. They worked the borders first, the neglected edges, the doorways. Emily drew 8 sections across a rough map of her farm. Then she called Margaret. "I need every portable fence panel you have." Margaret did not ask why. "I'll bring them." Emily called Dr. Holloway next. "I need help checking the flock tonight." "Are they sick?" "No." She looked at the western sky. "But tomorrow, they're going to work harder than they ever have." By sunset, Emily had divided the flock into rotating groups, placed water at 4 points, and repaired every weak fence. Margaret brought panels. Dr. Holloway checked the birds, and Tom Jenkins moved barrels without being asked. "You think the ducks can stop that?" Tom asked. "No," Emily said. "I think they can reduce it. Enough to matter. If we reach the borders first." The first swarm reached Johnson County shortly after dawn. It did not arrive like a cloud. It arrived like weather. The sky browned, sunlight weakened, and grasshoppers covered roads, pole, windows, and fields. Across the county, sprayers rolled from sheds and crop dusters lifted into the haze. At Hayes Farms, Caleb pointed toward the insects boiling out of a roadside ditch. "Shouldn't we start there?" Richard pointed toward the crop. "We protect what pays." The sprayer entered the field. Within 20 minutes, the first insects died. Within 40, another wave landed behind them. By 8 o'clock, the outer rows had begun losing leaves. At the Carter farm, Emily opened the southern gate. The ducks surged forward. For a moment, the flock seemed to become one moving body. Hundreds of white backs flowed into the ditch. Bills snapped, wings flapped. Grasshoppers lifted in frantic clouds, only to be caught before they could rise more than a few feet. Emily watched the first group for less than a minute before opening the next section. Another wave of ducks moved along the fence line, then another toward the creek. They did not need to be taught what to do. They only needed access. Margaret stood beside the road, staring. "I've seen ducks eat bugs." She shook her head. "I've never seen anything like this." Emily had. Not at this scale. But she had seen the beginning of it every morning for weeks. The pattern had always been there. The swarm simply made it visible. By mid-morning, neighboring fields were under heavy pressure. Tom Jenkins called to say the west side of his soybeans was being stripped. "Open the gate between our south pastures," Emily told him. "You'll lose control of the flock. I'll send 200 birds. My southern edge is holding." The ducks crossed before noon. They spread through Tom's ditch, and the first soybean rose, eating without pause. The leaf loss did not stop, but it slowed. Tom watched bare stems give way to damaged leaves that were still attached. "Dear God," he whispered. His son raised a phone to record. Tom pushed it down. "Help with the fencing." The boy obeyed. By noon, reports from around the county were worsening. Chemical suppliers had sold out. Crop dusters were booked for days. Several applicators were refusing new jobs because visibility was too poor. At Holloway Feed and Supply, farmers demanded chemicals Frank no longer had. Richard arrived, coated in insects, and stared at the empty pallets where Emily's reassigned feed should have been. Neither he nor Frank mentioned the symmetry. Back at Hayes Farms, Caleb reported that the last chemical tank was empty. The western soybeans looked burned without fire, and the north corn had begun losing leaf area. Richard climbed into his pickup. "Where are you going?" Caleb asked. Richard did not answer. He drove to the ridge overlooking Emily's farm. Several other vehicles were already parked there. Farmers stood along the road watching. On one side of the fence, insects covered the weeds. On the other, ducks moved through them in disciplined waves. Emily's soybeans still had leaves. Her corn still stood green. The difference was not perfect, but it was undeniable. Richard got out. Old Earl Benson removed his cap. "She told us." No one replied. A reporter from a Cedar Rapids television station arrived with a cameraman. Someone had sent footage of the ducks working Tom's field. The reporter approached Emily while she refilled a water trough. "Are you Emily Carter?" "Yes." We're hearing your ducks are stopping the swarm. They're not stopping it. The reporter glanced at the camera. But your crops are surviving. So far. How? Emily pointed toward the ditch. They've been reducing insect numbers along the field edges for weeks. Today they're doing the same thing faster. Is this some kind of new technique? Emily looked at the flock. No. It's an old one. People stopped taking seriously. The reporter smiled. Can we call it a miracle? Emily shook her head. Call it work? The clip aired before the evening news. Within an hour, more trucks began arriving. Some people came to watch. Others came to ask questions. A few came to ask for help. Emily refused the spectators. If you're here to take pictures, stay on the road. Then she looked at the farmers. If you're here to work, grab a fence panel. They did. Men who had laughed at Duck University now carried water tanks behind the flock. Teenagers who had quacked at Emily during the fair moved temporary fencing. Frank Holloway delivered every bag of supplemental feed he had. Tom Jenkins brought fuel. Margaret organized rotations from Emily's notebook. The county's ridicule did not disappear all at once. It transformed into silence first. Then attention. Then obedience. For 2 days, Emily moved the ducks among the nearest farms, suffering the heaviest damage. She accepted fuel, feed, labor, and access to land. But no cash. The flock could not save every field, nor could it consume a county-wide swarm. What it could do was intercept dense concentrations along selected borders before they established inside crops. County agronomists recorded insect counts before and after each rotation. Professor Daniel Mercer of Iowa State reviewed Emily's notebook and called it imperfect but valuable field evidence. He explained to the gathered farmers that the ducks had reduced local breeding populations for weeks and were now protecting entry points into a limited number of fields. They were not a miracle or a universal replacement for treatment under these particular conditions. However, they preserved enough leaf area to separate a damaged crop from a destroyed one. Richard listened from the back of the group. He said nothing. By the third morning, the insects shifted east. The sky lightened. The endless rattling weakened. Damage assessments began. Tom Jenkins had lost nearly a quarter of his western soybeans. But the eastern field remained largely intact after the ducks worked its border. Frank Holloway's corn showed damage on the creek side but remained harvestable. Several smaller farms survived with moderate losses. Emily's property had suffered less than any commercial operation in the immediate area. Richard's fields were among the worst. His western soybeans were nearly stripped. The northern corn had lost significant leaf area. His chemical expenses had doubled in 3 days, and the insects had kept returning. He drove to Emily's farm shortly after sunrise. The road was still crowded with pickups. He waited near the gate. Farmers walked past him. Some nodded. Most did not. Emily emerged from the barn carrying a bucket. She saw him. Neither spoke for several seconds. Richard removed his hat. I was wrong. Emily set down the bucket. He looked exhausted, as if the certainty that had carried him through every conversation had been stripped away with his soybeans. I told the bank your operation had no future, he said. I interfered with your feed credit. I laughed while this county turned you into a joke. And when you warned me about my ditches, proving you wrong mattered more to me than protecting my crop. Emily said nothing. Behind him, the horizon darkened with a smaller secondary swarm. Richard glanced back. My north corn may have a chance. Emily waited. He clenched the hat tighter. Please. The words seemed physically difficult for him. Let your ducks into my fields. The same road that had once carried people past Emily's farm to laugh now held 30 pickup trucks full of witnesses. No one spoke. Richard's voice dropped. I'll pay whatever you ask. Emily looked toward the flock, then toward his damaged fields. $100? Richard blinked. What? She held out her hand. The $100 bill from the Farm Bureau meeting. Richard stared at her. For one terrible moment. He thought this was the punishment. Public humiliation, in the same currency he had used against her. He reached into his wallet and removed the folded bill. Emily took it and handed it to Margaret. Buy lunch for everyone moving fences today? Richard stared at her. You're helping me? You don't get to buy forgiveness for $100. Emily placed a water bucket in his hands. But you can start earning it. Open the north gate. Richard's eyes filled. He turned away before the crowd could see. Before the ducks moved, Caleb stepped from the crowd, pale and shaking. I opened her gate, he said. Richard turned. You kept saying somebody should teach her what real farming costs. You never ordered me. I thought hurting her would make you respect me. Emily looked toward the cottonwoods, where she had buried the birds killed after the escape. Richard's face hardened, then collapsed under the meaning of his own words. No, he said quietly. I taught you cruelty and let you mistake it for loyalty. Emily did not offer Caleb absolution. After the swarm, you will give your statement to the sheriff. Right now. If you want to help what survived, carry water. The ducks entered Hayes Farms before noon. Richard and Caleb moved fences, hauled water, and followed Emily's instructions without argument. By evening, the secondary swarm had passed. Richard's north corn remained damaged, but alive. Enough leaf area survived to finish the season. Not enough for a record crop, enough to avoid ruin. That night, Richard apologized to Margaret at Miller's diner. You owe half the county one, she said, and you owe Emily more than words. I know. Then stop announcing that you were wrong. Start acting like it. She collected her coffee and left. The next morning, Richard called Mr. Collins at the bank. He asked for a special meeting of the lending cooperative. Then he called the editor of the Cedar Junction Gazette. Then, the Farm Bureau president. By afternoon, he had publicly admitted that he had influenced the bank's decision to shorten Emily's foreclosure timeline. The statement spread through town faster than any joke had. He did not excuse himself. He did not claim concern for the community. He said the truth. He had used his reputation to punish a smaller farmer because her methods challenged his pride. The bank suspended foreclosure proceedings immediately. Mr. Collins drove to the Carter farm himself. We're restoring the original timeline, he said. Emily folded her arms. That still gives me 30 days. We're also offering to restructure the operating loan. Why? Mr. Collins glanced toward the ducks. Your service has measurable value now. It had value before. Yes. He lowered his eyes. We failed to recognize it. Emily did not smile. What are the terms? Mr. Collins handed her the papers. She read every page before signing anything. Her father had taught her that gratitude was not a substitute for caution. Within 2 weeks, Emily had signed agreements with 6 farms for seasonal, monitored rotations along selected field edges. Professor Mercer helped design the measurements. Dr. Holloway wrote flock health standards. Tom built transport crates. And Margaret organized the schedule. The service would supplement, not replace other forms of pest management. The local FFA chapter rebuilt the sign beside Emily's barn in clean white letters. Duck University. Observe first. Act second. Inside the small office, Emily hung the cardboard Professor of Bankruptcy diploma beside her first signed contract. In September, the County Farm Bureau invited Emily to speak again. She entered the same meeting room, carrying the same black notebook. Every chair was occupied. No one laughed. Richard stood before she reached the front. He placed the $100 bill, now framed beneath glass, on the table. A small brass plate beneath it read, "The cost of laughing before listening." The room remained silent. Richard faced the farmers. 3 months ago, I stood in this room and used that bill to humiliate Emily Carter. He looked toward her. I believed acreage made me wiser. I believed equipment made me more modern. I believed success meant I could identify failure before it happened. He paused. What I actually proved was that pride can make a farmer blind while his eyes are open. He stepped away from the table. Emily approached the podium. She looked across the familiar faces. Some belonged to people who had mocked her. Some had helped search for escaped ducks. Some had carried fencing during the swarm. Most had done both. I didn't come here for an apology, she said. I came because next year there will be another problem. Maybe insects. Maybe drought. Maybe something none of us has seen before. She placed her notebook on the podium. And when someone notices it first, they may not have the largest farm. They may not have the newest equipment. They may not speak confidently. They may even be wrong. She looked toward Richard. But laughing teaches us nothing. The room stayed quiet. Ask questions. Check the evidence. Walk the ditch yourself. Then she smiled faintly. And never assume the land cares about your reputation. The applause began with Margaret, then Tom and Frank. And finally, every farmer in the room. Richard remained standing after the others sat down. The framed $100 bill stayed on the table between him and Emily, not a symbol of instant forgiveness. But a receipt for the day certainty became expensive. Harvest came late that year. The county lost thousands of bushels. Some families struggled. Insurance covered part of the damage, but not all of it. Still, the farms protected early by Emily's rotations produced enough to continue. Her own corn yielded below the county average. Her soybeans did better. Combined with service contracts, local donations of labor, and a small research grant from Iowa State, the harvest brought enough money to stop foreclosure. On the morning, she made the final overdue payment. Emily wore her father's jacket to the bank. Mr. Collins stamped the document. Current, not paid, in full, not wealthy, not safe forever, but current. For a working farm, that word was victory enough. Outside, Richard waited beside his pickup. He handed her an envelope. What is this? A feed invoice. Emily opened it. Every bag he had bought during the shortage was listed. Beneath the total, Richard had written, repaid at double cost. Emily handed it back. I don't want double. You should. I want the actual cost. Emily, and next spring, you reserve 10 acres of field edge for a research trial. Richard smiled slightly. That all? You provide the labor? His smile faded. All of it? All of it. He nodded. Fair. By the following spring, Iowa State students were visiting the Carter farm to measure insect density, soil compaction, manure distribution, and crop response. Emily warned every group that ducks were one tool, not a universal answer. Richard supplied 10 acres, fencing, transport, and all the labor for the first controlled trial. One morning, Emily found him repairing a post beneath the Duck University sign. Inside the office, the fake bankruptcy diploma hung beside the bank notice, stamped current. The first service contract, and a waiting list filled with names of farmers who once had laughed. Richard looked toward the sign. This county will tell the story wrong. He said, they'll say 800 ducks saved the harvest. They helped. What will they leave out? Emily opened her black notebook. Its first pages held unpaid bills and weak fence posts. The middle recorded insects no one believed mattered. The last contained contracts, research notes, and the names of farms that survived. The mornings no one watched, she said. The feed, the fences, the counting, the losses, the days it looked foolish. People prefer miracles to work. Emily opened the pasture gate. The ducks moved toward the southern ditch in a white stream, but the land knows the difference. Months earlier, Johnson County had called Emily Carter the professor of bankruptcy. Now, the farmers who had laughed the loudest waited for space on her schedule. Richard Hayes had offered her $100 to prove she was a fool. In the end, the money bought lunch. His pride cost him nearly everything else. The joke remained painted above the barn. Duck University. Only the person being laughed at had changed.